Thank you. You may be seated. I don't know if you noticed it, but quietly tucked away in our first lesson this morning is a rather thought-provoking story, a story that if we take the time to actually reflect on it, can have some huge implications for our lives and for our homes. A story that is particularly relevant on a day like Mother's Day, and yet it is a story that is often missed by many people. It's the story of a man by the name of Obed-Edom and a visit he once received from a stranger. It all begins, so says the author of 2 Samuel, when King David was leading a royal procession of about 30,000 men from Kiriath Jearim back to Jerusalem. David had gone to Kiriath Jearim to retrieve the long-absent Ark of the Covenant. 20 years earlier, the Philistines had stolen it from the Israelites after they had defeated them in battle. And since that time, the Ark of the Covenant had been stowed away in storage. Now the Israelites were back in power, and the victorious King David wanted the Ark of the Covenant back. He wanted to take it to Jerusalem and make Jerusalem the center of the religious life of the entire nation. Why? Why was it so important to King David to put the ark at the center of the religious and the national life of the people? Simply put, the Israelites regarded the Ark of the Covenant as the very throne upon which God sat. So, in other words, to be in the presence of the Ark of the Covenant was to be in the actual presence of God. So to have the Ark of the Covenant in Jerusalem was something about which all of the people could rejoice and celebrate. However, somewhere along the way, as they were carrying the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, an unfortunate accident occurred. The oxen that were pulling the cart that was carrying the ark stumbled, and one of the men in the royal procession, Uzzah, reached up to steady the ark, and when he did, he was suddenly killed. And suddenly fear and anxiety swept through the entire procession of people. People began to sense that as wonderful as the Ark of the Covenant was, it also possessed a strange and a dangerous power, and they wondered whether or not they should bring this Ark of the Covenant into the city of Jerusalem. Even King David seemed to have his concerns because he began to look around for a place to leave the Ark of the Covenant, and he settled on the nearby farm of Obed-Edom. Who is Obed-Edom? We don't really know for sure that much about him. The Bible doesn't say much about him. Scholars can only give us a thumbnail sketch of who he was. But there are a few things that we know about him. For example, we know that Obed-Edom was a Gentile and a pagan. His very name, Obed-Edom, literally meant servant of the God of Edom. We also note that he was a Philistine, and as a Philistine, he was now one of the conquered enemies of the Israelites. And then, too, we know that Obed-Edom had a family, maybe even a very large family. In our lesson this morning, it spoke of the whole household of Obed-Edom. Well, what a moment it must have been then when King David and the whole royal procession show up on his doorstep. Try to picture yourself as Obed-Edom for just a moment. It's late in the afternoon, you're inside watching a ball game on the television. And all of a sudden there's a knock at the door, and when you answer it, there stands King David in all of his royal regalia, and behind him is that whole procession of people. After introductions, King David explains to you that he intends to leave the Ark of the Covenant in your home. Well, still bewildered and confused by all of the events that have taken place, you look behind King David and you see what is obviously the Ark of the Covenant, the size of which alone lets you know that this is not going to be something you're going to be able to take and put in a closet until David decides to come back again. And so your reaction to King David is a bit of a mixed one. The Ark of the Covenant? I don't know anything about any Ark of the Covenant. The only ark I know anything about is Noah's Ark. And I can tell that this isn't it. And so King David explains the story that this is the throne of God. And then after he explains it, he has his men take the Ark of the Covenant and put it right in the center of your home. And after all has been said, after all has been done, King David and the others turn and they leave. Now, can you begin to get a hint of what Obed-Edom and his family must have felt in that moment? What happens next? Strangely enough, if you look very carefully at our text, you will discover that the Bible tells us that because of the Ark of the Covenant in Obed-Edom's house, because of the presence of the Lord in that place, the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and his entire household, so much so that people started talking about it, and they started talking about it, and over the next 3 months, word eventually reaches King David, and King David, now feeling that it is once again safe because of the blessings of Obed-Edom, goes and gets the Ark of the Covenant, and the procession to Jerusalem resumes. Now, I don't know about you, but all of this raises a very important question to me. What happened during that 3-month period while the Ark of the Covenant was in the home of Obed-Edom? What was there about the presence of the Ark of the Covenant that brought such blessing to Obed-Edom and to his family? Well, really, before you can answer that question, you first have to imagine, at least, what life might have been like for Obed-Edom and his family before King David showed up on his doorstep. Perhaps Obed-Edom's family was not all that different from many of our homes today, perhaps like many families today. Obed-Edom and his family were in search of their own version of the American dream. Maybe Obed-Edom and his wife had such a drive and a desire for success, to be financially independent, to live in a bigger and a better household, to drive the newest and the most fashionable car, to own all of the latest in technology, that they were literally driven by these things. And I hope that even as I say this, you understand that I'm not suggesting that it's wrong in any way to want these things. There's nothing wrong with wanting these things or wanting to better yourself and your family. But there is, I think, a very fine line between wanting these things and being driven by these things. Perhaps that was it. Perhaps like many families today, Obed-Edom and his family were just living lives that were too busy. Maybe they had so many activities and responsibilities and commitments on their calendar that they just couldn't keep up with it all. Several years ago, there was a little devotional book that was released for families, and I've always been intrigued by the title of that book. It was entitled Little House on the Freeway. And that's a pretty good description of the way that a lot of us live our lives, isn't it? And the way many of our families live their lives. I remember talking with a couple in a church I once served. They had been members and they had attended, but then all of a sudden they were not attending much anymore. And so one day I went out to visit with them, just to talk with them. And during the course of our conversation, the wife said to me, I'll never forget it, the wife said to me, "Preacher, we have so much going on in our lives, we don't have time for church." May I suggest to you that if you have so much going on in your lives that you don't have time for church, you have too much going on in your lives. Because you see, if we're not careful, what we can do is end up with calendars that are full and lives that are empty. Or maybe like some homes today, there was something much more sinister and destructive at work in the home of Obed-Edom, a secret of some kind, or a dependency of some sort, say alcohol or drugs or pornography, or the kind of relationship that shouldn't be interfering with a family. Or perhaps what was going on in the home of Obed-Edom was completely different from any of these things. In fact, the truth is it probably was different. Obed-Edom and his family lived in a different day and in a different culture. But if they were living in our day, if they were living in our culture, I think these might have been the sort of issues that they faced. Because you see, if you're not building your lives and your families around the living God, capital G, then you are building your life and your family's life around other gods, little g. The choice is not whether or not you're going to build your life or your family's life around a God. We were created in such a way that that is a given. The only choice we have, really, is what God we're going to build our lives around. Well, in any case, what we do know is that whatever Obed-Edom's house was like before David showed up on his doorstep, after they brought the Ark of the Covenant into his house, things radically changed. Of course, it had to be so. First of all, there was the sheer size of the Ark of the Covenant itself. The Ark of the Covenant was no small object. It literally took several men to carry it. Its dimensions were about 4 feet long by 3 feet wide by 3 feet deep. And while that may not sound very large to many of us today, given the proportionate size of the homes in that day and in that culture, in all probability, they would have had to set the Ark of the Covenant right in the center of Obed-Edom's house. Listen, that would have meant that Obed-Edom and his family would have had to reorder the practical living of their lives around the Ark of the Covenant or the presence of God. Are you hearing what I'm saying in that? They would have had to reorder around the presence of God. Not only that, but there's a good chance that before King David and the others left Obed-Edom's house that day, they related to him the story of Uzzah. They no doubt told him that the Ark of the Covenant, he needed to be very careful with it and take it very seriously, because as wonderful as it was, it also possessed a very strange and a dangerous power. And so for the first time, Obed-Edom and his family had to take God very seriously. And undoubtedly, that impacted their attitudes and their actions. For example, I've got a hunch that it probably meant that their values radically changed. When God takes up residence in our homes, and when there is a sense of the divine in our midst, life simply cannot go on as it always has. Things begin to change. There's a new meaning and there is a new purpose. Relationships become more important than remote controls. Building character becomes more important than building a career. Making a mark that makes a positive difference in the lives of others becomes more important than making money. And again, it's not that these other things are unimportant or wrong. It's just that they are not as important. And then too, we know that Obed-Edom and his family began to experience blessings in ways that they had not experienced them before. No doubt, they became more aware with the Ark of the Covenant in the center of their home, more aware of God's love and God's presence and God's power and God's grace. No doubt old habits and hurts began to fade away, and in their places, hope began to grow, faith began to flourish, and love began to permeate their lives. So much so that other people couldn't help but notice. And they started talking about it. And they started sharing it. And you know how word can go from one person to another person, and it spread all across that community and across the country until eventually it reached the ears of King David in the palace. And King David said, I want to have those kind of blessings in my life that Obed-Edom has in his. And he went and retrieved the Ark of the Covenant. Well, I hope by now it's become obvious. Regardless of whether or not you are married or single, regardless of whether or not you have the conventional nuclear family of a husband and wife, 2 children, a dog, a cat, goldfish, and an SUV, or whether or not you're a single parent and struggling, whether or not you are living alone or you are living in a household full of people. The key to building strong lives, that build strong communities, that build strong nations, begins in whatever kind of home you live in. It begins as one or more family members make a commitment to live under the lordship of Jesus Christ and a commitment to be God's person. It begins when families take God seriously and put God right at the center of their homes. Dear friends, this is the lesson that we can learn from Obed-Edom. And this is the good news for this morning. Our gracious and loving God, we give you thanks for this day. We give you thanks for your promise always to be with us. And oh Lord, whether we live in a large family or we live by ourselves, help us to order our lives around you rather than expecting you to order your life around us. And help us so to live, that others take notice of you and share the story of your love. In the name of Christ we pray, amen. Our closing hymn is hymn number 643, When Love is Found.